Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 32, Part 1, The Beginning of a Long Journey. What is natural in me is natural in many other men, I infer, and so I'm not afraid to write that I never had loved Steerforth better than when the ties that bound me to him were broken. In the keen distress of the discovery of his unworthiness, I thought more of all that was brilliant in him. I softened more towards all that was good in him. I did more justice to the qualities that might have made him a man of a noble nature and a great name than ever I had done in the height of my devotion to him. Deeply as I felt my own unconscious part in his pollution of an honest home, I believed that if I had been brought face to face with him, I could not have uttered one reproach. I should have loved him so well still, though he fascinated me no longer. I should have held in so much tenderness the memory of my affection for him, that I think I should have been as weak as a spirit-wounded child in all but the entertainment of a thought that we could ever be reunited. That thought I never had. I felt, as he had felt, that all was at an end between us. What his remembrances of me were, I have never known. They were light enough, perhaps, and easily dismissed, but mine of him were as the remembrances of a cherished friend who was dead. Yes, Steerforth, long removed from the scenes of this poor history. My sorrow may bear involuntary witness against you at the judgment throne, but my angry thoughts or my reproaches never will, I know. The news of what had happened soon spread through the town, insomuch that as I passed along the streets next morning, I overheard the people speaking of it at their doors. Many were hard upon her, some few were hard upon him, but towards her second father and her lover there was but one sentiment. Among all kinds of people, a respect for them in their distress prevailed, which was full of gentleness and delicacy. The seafaring men kept apart when those two were seen early walking with slow steps on the beach, and stood in knots, talking compassionately among themselves. It was on the beach, close down by the sea, that I found them. It would have been easy to perceive that they had not slept all last night, even if Peggotty had failed to tell me of their still sitting just as I left them when it was broad day. They looked worn, and I thought Mr. Peggotty's head was bowed in one night more than in all the years I had known him. But they were both as grave and steady as the sea itself, then lying beneath a dark sky, waveless, yet with a heavy roll upon it, as if it breathed in its rest, and touched on the horizon with a strip of silvery light from the unseen sun. "We have had a mort of talk, sir," said Mr. Peggotty to me when we had all three walked a little while in silence, "of what we ought and don't ought to do. But we see our course now." I happened to glance at Ham, then, looking out to sea upon the distant light, and a frightful thought came into my mind. Not that his face was angry, for it was not. I recall nothing but an expression of stern determination in it, that if ever he encountered Steerforth, he would kill him. My duty here, sir, said Mr. Peggotty, is done. I'm a-going to seek my... He stopped and went on in a firmer voice. I'm a-going to seek her. That's my duty evermore. He shook his head when I asked him where he would seek her, and inquired if I were going to London tomorrow. I told him I had not gone today, fearing to lose the chance of being of any service to him, but that I was ready to go when he would. I'll go along with you, sir, he rejoined, if you're agreeable, tomorrow. We walked again for a while in silence. Ham, he presently resumed, he'll hold to his present work and go and live along with my sister. The old boat yonder... Will you desert the old boat, Mr. Peggotty? I gently interposed. My station, Master Davy, he returned, ain't there no longer. And if ever a boat foundered since there was darkness on the face of the deep, that one's gone down. But no, sir, no. I don't mean as it should be deserted. Far from that. We walked again for a while, as before, until he explained. My wishes is, sir, as it shall look day and night, winter and summer, as it has always looked, since she first knowed it. If ever she should come a-wandering back, I wouldn't have the old place seem to cast her off, you understand, but seem to tempt her, to draw nigh her to it, and to peep in, maybe, like a ghost out of the wind and rain through the old window at the old seat by the fire. Then maybe, Master Davy, seeing none but Mrs. Gummidge there, she might take heart to creep in, trembling, and might come to be laid down in her old bed and rest her weary head where it was once so gay. I could not speak to him in reply, though I tried. Every night, said Mr. Peggotty, as regular as the night comes, the candle must be stood in its old pane of glass, that if ever she should see it, it may seem to say, come back, my child, come back. If ever there's a knock, Ham particular, a soft knock, arter dark, at your aunt's door, don't you go nigh it. Let it be her, not you, that sees my fallen child. He walked a little in front of us and kept before us for some minutes. During this interval I glanced at Ham again, and observing the same expression on his face, and his eyes still directed to the distant light, I touched his arm. Twice I called him by his name in the tone in which I might have tried to rouse a sleeper before he heeded me. When I at last inquired on what his thoughts were so bent, he replied, "And what's afore me, Master Davy? And over yon, on the life before you, do you mean?" He had pointed confusedly out to sea. "Aye, Master Davy. I don't rightly know how 'tis, but from over yon there seemed to me to come the end of it like." Looking at me as if he were waking, but with the same determined face. "What end?" I asked, possessed by my former fear. "I don't know," he said thoughtfully. "I was calling to mind that the beginning of it all did take place here, and then the end come. But it's gone, Master Davy," he added, answering, as I think, my look. "You hadn't no call to be afeard of me, but I'm kind of muddled. I don't fare to feel no matters," which was as much as to say that he was not himself and quite confounded. Mr. Peggotty, stopping for us to join him, we did so, and said no more. The remembrance of this in connection with my former thought, however, haunted me at intervals, even until the inexorable end came at its appointed time. We insensibly approached the old boat and entered. Mrs. Gummidge, no longer moping in her especial corner, was busy preparing breakfast. She took Mr. Peggotty's hat and placed his seat for him, and spoke so comfortably and softly that I hardly knew her. "Daniel, my good man," said she, "you must eat and drink, and keep up your strength, for without it you'll do nought. Try, that's a dear soul, and if I disturb you with my clicketing," she meant her chattering, "tell me so, Daniel, and I won't." When she had served us all, she withdrew to the kitchen, where she sedulously employed herself in repairing some shirts and other clothes belonging to Mr. Peggotty, and neatly folding and packing them in an old oilskin bag such as sailors carry. Meanwhile, she continued talking in the same quiet manner. "All times and seasons, you know, Daniel," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I shall be always here, and everything will look according to your wishes. I'm a poor scholar, but I shall write to you odd times when you're away, and send my letters to Master Davy. Maybe you'll write to me too, Daniel, odd times, and tell me how you fare to feel upon your lorn journey." "You'll be solitary woman here, I'm afeard," said Mr. Peggotty. No, Daniel," she returned. "I shan't be that. Don't you mind me. I shall have enough to do to keep a being for you." Mrs. Gummidge meant her home. "Again, you come back to keep a being here for any that may have to come back, Dan. In the fine time I shall set outside the door as I used to do. If any should come nigh, they shall see the old widder woman true to 'em a long way off." What a change in Mrs. Gummidge in a little time! She was another woman. She was so devoted, she had such a quick perception of what it would be well to say and what it would be well to leave unsaid. She was so forgetful of herself and so regardful of the sorrow about her that I held her in a sort of veneration. The work she did that day! There were many things to be brought up from the beach and stored in the outhouses: oars, nets, sails, cordage, spars, lobster pots, bags of ballast, and the like. And though there was abundance of assistance rendered, there being not a pair of working hands on all that shore but would have laboured hard for Mr. Peggotty, and been well paid in being asked to do it, yet she persisted all day long in toiling under weights that she was quite unequal to, and fagging to and fro on all sorts of unnecessary errands. As to deploring her misfortunes, she appeared to have entirely lost the recollection of ever having had any. She preserved an equable cheerfulness in the midst of her sympathy, which was not the least astonishing part of the change that had come over her. Querulousness was out of the question. I did not even observe her voice to falter or a tear to escape from her eyes the whole day through until twilight, when she and I and Mr. Peggotty being alone together, and he having fallen asleep in perfect exhaustion, she broke into a half-suppressed fit of sobbing and crying, and, taking me to the door, said, "Ever bless you, Master Davy. Be a friend to him. Poor dear." Then she immediately ran out of the house to wash her face, in order that she might sit quietly beside him and be found at work there when he should awake. In short, I left her, when I went away at night, the prop and staff of Mr. Peggotty's affliction, and I could not meditate enough upon the lesson that I read in Mrs. Gummidge, and the new experience she unfolded to me. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock when, strolling in a melancholy manner through the town, I stopped at Mr. Omer's door. Mr. Omer had taken it so much to heart, his daughter told me, that he had been very low and poorly all day, and had gone to bed without his pipe. "A deceitful, bad-hearted girl," said Mrs. Joram. "There was no good in her ever." "Don't say so," I returned. "You don't think so?" "Yes, I do," cried Mrs. Joram angrily. No, said I. Mrs. Joram tossed her head, endeavouring to be very stern and cross, but she could not command her softer self, and began to cry. I was young, to be sure, but I thought much the better of her for this sympathy, and fancied it became her as a virtuous wife and mother very well indeed. "What will she ever do?" sobbed Minnie. "Where will she go? What will become of her? Oh, how could she be so cruel to herself and him?" I remembered the time when Minnie was a young and pretty girl, and I was glad she remembered it too, so feelingly. "My little Minnie," said Mrs. Joram, "has only just now been got to sleep. Even in her sleep she is sobbing for Emily. All day long little Minnie has cried for her and asked me over and over again whether Emily was wicked. What can I say to her? When Emily tied a ribbon off her own neck round little Minnie's the last night she was here, and laid her head down on the pillow beside her till she was fast asleep. The ribbon's round my little Minnie's neck now. It ought not to be, perhaps, but what can I do? Emily is very bad, but they were fond of one another, and the child knows nothing." Mrs. Joram was so unhappy that her husband came out to take care of her. Leaving them together, I went home to Peggotty's, more melancholy myself, if possible, than I had been yet. That good creature, Peggotty, all untired by her late anxieties and sleepless nights, was at her brother's, where she meant to stay till morning. An old woman who had been employed about the house for some weeks past, while Peggotty was unable to attend to it, was the house's only other occupant besides myself. As I had no occasion for her services, I sent her to bed, by no means against her will, and sat down before the kitchen fire a little while to think about all this. I was blending it with the deathbed of the late Mr. Barkis, and was driving out with the tide towards the distance of which Ham had looked so singularly in the morning, when I was recalled from my wanderings by a knock at the door. There was a knocker upon the door, but it was not that which made the sound. The tap was from a hand, and low down upon the door, as if it were given by a child. It made me start as much as if it had been the knock of a footman to a person of distinction. I opened the door, and at first looked down, to my amazement, on nothing but a great umbrella that appeared to be walking about of itself. But presently I discovered underneath it Miss Moucher. I might not have been prepared to give the little creature a very kind reception if, on her removing the umbrella, which her utmost efforts were unable to shut up, she had shown me the volatile expression of face which had made so great an impression on me at our first and last meeting. But her face, as she turned it up to mine, was so earnest, and when I relieved her of the umbrella, which would have been an inconvenient one for the Irish giant, she wrung her little hands in such an afflicted manner that I rather inclined towards her. "Miss Moucher," said I, after glancing up and down the empty street without distinctly knowing what I expected to see besides, "how do you come here? What is the matter?" She motioned to me with her short right arm to shut the umbrella for her, and passing me hurriedly went into the kitchen. When I had closed the door and followed with the umbrella in my hand, I found her sitting on the corner of the fender. It was a low iron one with 2 flat bars at top to stand plates upon, in the shadow of the boiler, swaying herself backwards and forwards and chafing her hands upon her knees like a person in pain. Quite alarmed at being the only recipient of this untimely visit, and the only spectator of this portentous behaviour, I exclaimed again, "Pray tell me, Miss Moucher, what is the matter? Are you ill?" "My dear young soul," returned Miss Moucher, squeezing her hands upon her heart, one over the other, "I am ill here. I am very ill. To think that it should come to this, when I might have known it and perhaps prevented it if I hadn't been a thoughtless fool." Again, her large bonnet, very disproportionate to the figure, went backwards and forwards in her swaying of her little body to and fro, while a most gigantic bonnet rocked in unison with it upon the wall. "I am surprised," I began, "to see you so distressed and serious," when she interrupted me. "Yes, it's always so," she said. "They are always surprised, these inconsiderate young people, fairly and full grown, to see any natural feeling in a little thing like me. They make a plaything of me, use me for their amusement, throw me away when they're tired, and wonder that I feel more than a toy horse or a wooden soldier. Yes, that's the way, the old way." "It may be with others," I returned, "but I do assure you it is not with me. Perhaps I ought not to be at all surprised to see you as you are now. I know so little of you," I said, without consideration. What I thought. "What can I do?" returned the little woman, standing up and holding out her arms to show herself. "See what I am, my father was, and my sister is, and my brother is. I have worked for sister and brother these many years, hard, Mr. Copperfield, all day. I must live. I do no harm. If there are people so unreflecting or so cruel as to make a jest of me, what is left for me to do but to make a jest of myself, them, and everything? If I do so for the time, whose fault is that? Mine?" "No, not Miss Moucher's," I perceived. "If I had shown myself a sensitive dwarf to your false friend," pursued the little woman, shaking her head at me with reproachful earnestness, "how much of his help or goodwill do you think I should ever have had? If little Moucher, who had no hand, young gentleman, in the making of herself, addressed herself to him, or the like of him, because of her misfortunes, when do you suppose her small voice would have been heard? Little Moucher would have as much need to live if she was the bitterest and dullest of pygmies, but she couldn't do it. No, she might whistle for her bread and butter till she died of air." Miss Moucher sat down on the fender again and took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes. "Be thankful for me if you have a kind heart, as I think you have," she said, "that while I know well what I am, I can be cheerful and endure it all. I am thankful for myself, at any rate, that I can find my tiny way through the world without being beholden to anyone, and that in return for all that is thrown at me in folly or vanity as I go along, I can throw bubbles back If I don't brood over all I want, it is the better for me and not the worse for anyone. If I am a plaything for you giants, be gentle with me." Miss Moucher replaced her handkerchief in her pocket, looking at me with very intent expression all the while, and pursued. "I saw you in the street just now. You may suppose I'm not able to walk as fast as you with my short legs and short breath, and I couldn't overtake you, but I guess where you came and came after you. I've been here before today, but the good woman wasn't at home." "Do you know her?" I demanded. "I know of her and about her," she replied. "From Omer and Joram. I was there at 7 o'clock this morning. Do you remember what Steerforth said to me about this unfortunate girl that time when I saw you both at the inn?" The great bonnet on Miss Moucher's head and the greater bonnet on the wall began to go backwards and forwards again when she asked this question. I remembered very well what she referred to, having had it in my thoughts many times that day. I told her so. "May the father of all evil confound him," said the little woman, holding up her forefinger between me and her sparkling eyes, "and 10 times more confound that wicked servant. But I believed it was you who had a boyish passion for her." I repeated. Child? In the name of blind ill fortune," cried Miss Moucher, wringing her hands impatiently as she went to and fro again upon the fender, "why did you praise her so, and blush, and look disturbed?" I could not conceal from myself that I had done this, though for a reason very different from her supposition. "What did I know?" said Miss Moucher, taking out her handkerchief again and giving one little stamp on the ground whenever, at short intervals, she applied it to her eyes with both hands at once. "He was crossing you and wheedling you, I saw, and you were soft wax in his hands, I saw. Had I left the room a minute when his man told me that young innocence, so he called you, and you may call him old guilt all the days of your life, had set his heart upon her, and she was giddy and liked him, but his master was resolved that no harm should come of it, more for your sake than for hers, and that was their business here. How could I but believe him? I saw Steerforth soothe and please you by his praise of her. You were the first to mention her name. You owned to an old admiration of her. You were hot and cold and red and white, all at once when I spoke to you of her. What could I think? What did I think? But that you were a young libertine in everything but experience, and had fallen into hands that had experience enough, and could manage you, having the fancy for your own good. They were afraid of my finding out the truth," exclaimed Miss Moucher, getting off the fender and trotting up and down the kitchen with her 2 short arms distressfully lifted up, "because I am a sharp little thing, I need be to get through the world at all. And they deceived me altogether, and I gave the poor unfortunate girl a letter which I fully believe was the beginning of her ever speaking to Littimer, who was left behind on purpose." I stood amazed at the revelation of all this perfidy, looking at Miss Moucher as she walked up and down the kitchen until she was out of breath. When she sat upon the fender again and, drying her face with her handkerchief, shook her head for a long time without otherwise moving and without breaking silence. "My country rounds," she added at length, "brought me to Norwich, Mr. Copperfield, the night before last. What I happened to find there about their secret way of coming and going without you, which was strange, led to my suspecting something wrong. I got into the coach from London last night as it came through Norwich, and was here this morning. Oh, too late. Poor little Moucher turned so chilly after all her crying and fretting that she turned round on the fender, putting her poor little wet feet in among the ashes to warm them, and sat looking at the fire like a large doll. I sat in a chair on the other side of the hearth, lost in unhappy reflections, and looking at the fire too, and sometimes at her. "I must go," she said at last, rising as she spoke. "It's late." "You don't mistrust me?" Meeting her sharp glance, which was as sharp as ever when she asked me, I could not, on that short challenge, answer no, quite frankly. "Come," said she, accepting the offer of my hand to help her over the fender and looking wistfully up into my face. "You know you wouldn't mistrust me if I was a full-sized woman." I felt that there was much truth in this, and I felt rather ashamed of myself. "You are a young man," she said, nodding. "Take a word of advice, even from 3-foot-nothing. Try not to associate bodily defects with mental, my good friend, except for a solid reason." She had got over the fender now, and I had got over my suspicion. I told her that I believed she had given me a faithful account of herself, and that we had both been hapless instruments in designing hands. She thanked me and said I was a good fellow. "Now mind," she exclaimed, turning back on her way to the door and looking shrewdly at me with her forefinger up again, "I have some reason to suspect, from what I've heard, my ears are always open, I can't afford to spare what powers I have, that they are gone abroad. But if ever they return, if ever any one of them returns while I'm alive, I am more likely than another, going about as I do, to find it out soon. Whatever I know, you shall know. If ever I can do anything to serve the poor betrayed girl, I will do it faithfully, please heaven. And Littimer had better have a bloodhound at his back than little Moucher." I placed implicit faith in this last statement when I marked the look with which it was accompanied. "Trust me no more, but trust me no less than you would trust a full-sized woman," said the little creature, touching me appealingly on the wrist. "If ever you see me again, unlike what I am now, and like what I was when you first saw me, observe what company I'm in. Call to mind that I am a very helpless and defenseless little thing. Think of me at home with my brother like myself and sister like myself, when my day's work is done. Perhaps you won't then be very hard upon me, or surprised if I can be distressed and serious. Good night." I gave Miss Moucher my hand with a very different opinion of her from that which I had hitherto entertained, and opened the door to let her out. It was not a trifling business to get the great umbrella up and properly balanced in her grasp, but at last I successfully accomplished this, and saw it go bobbing down the street through the rain without the least appearance of having anybody underneath it, except when a heavier fall than usual from some overcharged waterspout sent it toppling over on one side and discovered Miss Moucher struggling violently to get it right. After making one or two sallies to her relief, which were rendered futile by the umbrella's hopping on again like an immense bird before I could reach it, I came in, went to bed, and slept till morning. Thank you so much for joining me. The second part of Chapter 32 I will read tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific, at Fireside Reading on Instagram. And all the chapters I upload to the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading. And please, if you like, subscribe and comment and like. I love getting those. Until I see you all again, please stay very well. Good night.